Last week I mentioned that humanity doesn't have an evidence problem. Humanity has an authority problem. We talked about the fact that, there's a sentiment sometimes that says, show me the evidence. God, prove yourself to me, and if you show me enough evidence, I'll respond in faith to you. There's that sentiment that is spoken even sometimes, and I would submit to you that it wasn't true then, and it's not true now. Mankind has an authority problem. We don't want to submit to anyone without the title of I or me. That's who we want to submit to. Me, myself, and I. We have a hard time. Our stubborn heart doesn't want to give up the loyalty that we have to ourselves. We don't crown anyone else king. And in the last couple weeks, we've seen in Matthew, Jesus perform one miracle, two miracles, three miracles, and a call to respond. Follow me. We've seen it once at the beginning of chapter 8. Then in chapter 8 into chapter 9, again, one miracle, two miracles, three miracles, and a call, follow me. We're going to see that same pattern, a triad of miracles. This time there's two couplets to begin the beginning here in our series. But there's, again, three miracles and a call again to respond to King Jesus. And we'll see in our text today, actually, we saw some last week, but kind of a mounting lack of response. The crowds, the many that reject. And yet there's a few that respond to King Jesus. It's a call today. It's a call today to be the few. Be the few. To respond to this call. To not be like the many that reject, but be one of the few that respond to King Jesus. It's interesting today. Let's read the text together. We're going to be in chapter 9, beginning in verse 14. We'll read through the end of the chapter as we witness this pattern in Matthew one more time here. Matthew 9 verse 14 says, Then the disciples of John came to Jesus saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth to an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break and the wine is spilled and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. While he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, said, Be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. When Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, he said to them, Make room, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went out into all the land. When Jesus departed from there, two blind men followed him, crying out and saying, Son of David, have mercy on us. And when he had come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, Do you believe that I am able to do this? And they said to him, Yes, Lord. And he touched their eyes, saying, According to your faith, let it be to you. And their eyes were opened. And Jesus sternly warned them, saying, See that no one knows this. But when they had departed, they spread the news about him into all that country. And as they went out, behold, they brought to him a man mute and demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke. And the multitudes marveled, saying, It was never seen like this in Israel. But The Pharisees said he casts out demons by the ruler of the demons. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." The passage here in this text starts with some folks trying to figure out Jesus Christ. You see them coming to him, and we see in the text here in verse 14, it's the disciples of John. John, really in the scriptures and the gospels, needs no introduction. This is John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, and they come to Jesus with an honest question. Why do your disciples not fast like we do? Now remember, if you were here last week, what does the text right before this tell us about Jesus? Jesus was, in this context, he had just finished a lavish feast at the tax collector Matthew's house. Matthew was quite wealthy, like most tax collectors in his day, and so there would have been a nice feast that they just enjoyed. I was reading this week that religious Jews of the first century would typically fast twice a week. They would typically fast on Monday and Thursday. I don't know, that was fast days, okay? So we could imagine this text. The party was on Monday or Thursday. And the disciples of John and the other religious folks, the Jews, are fasting, and they look over, and what's Jesus doing? While they're fasting, he's feasting. And they're going, this is supposed to be a special day where we fast and we worship God, and you're over there with these sinners, which was highlighted earlier, but you're also over there feasting, and there's confusion, and there's a little bit of a critique here. What are you guys doing while we're doing this? You know, it's interesting. We love to compare ourselves among ourselves, don't we? We're really good at it. And typically when we do that, it's typically like in a sense here, there's well, I'm doing this and you're doing that, right? Where we look down our noses at others for not doing and measuring up to something that we think they should be, or measuring up to our expectations or our lifestyle. Interesting that most of the time, we do that comparison behind other people's backs. If you read chapter 9 here, verse 11, we saw that earlier the Pharisees were critiquing Jesus, and they did it to Jesus' disciples in chapter 9, verse 11. Usually we do that. We compare ourselves among ourselves to somebody else, but we don't talk to them directly. We talk behind their back with somebody else, the disciples of Jesus, chapter 9, verse 11. I love here in this text, John's disciples do what? They go to the source. They go to Jesus and they talk to him directly. I appreciate that in here in this text. It's an honest question, and Jesus gives an honest answer to them in this text. And the short of the answer is this: that Jesus is the new, and the old has been waiting all this time for him. That's the kind of short answer of this. You see, there's an invitation in this passage that says, Jesus, why aren't you being like us? And Jesus is saying, you're missing it. You're missing all the old practices are pointing to the fulfillment of them in Jesus. Here in this text, he gives 3 unthinkable ceremonies. He said it would be unthinkable for us to go to a wedding feast, a wedding ceremony, and to mourn. I mean, some people cry at weddings, but it's typically, tears of joy, right? We assume at least, right? It's meant to be joy at a wedding ceremony. He says it's unthinkable to have a mourner at a wedding. That just doesn't compute. He says it's unthinkable. The next 2 kind of maybe don't make sense to you today in our modern context, but if you're a sewer and you don't have pre-washed material, he's talking about, this stretching that occurs between old and new. You don't do those together. The wineskins that were made out of animal skins would stretch and be pliable with the new and the new wine, and you wouldn't mix old with new. These are unthinkable combinations that he gives here in this text. And the point is, you don't put the old with the new. You embrace the new is what you do. So the text here is setting up for us. The question is, Jesus, why aren't you conforming yourself to us and our expectations? And Jesus is instead saying, I'm inviting you to join me in the new. It's an interesting passage here. You know, today in our modern context, we can do the same thing. We can look at Jesus and go, I want you to conform to me. I want you, God, to conform to my image. And what does God call us to do? He calls us to conform to his image. That's what there's a contrast here in this passage. The invitation is not, Jesus, you join us. Jesus is saying, you join me as one of the few. One of the few in this context here. This invitation going two different directions as we open the text. So we should be, when we come to this text, we should be looking at these miracles and thinking to ourselves, who is this Jesus? And what are we invited to by him as we approach the text that Matthew gives us to follow? So let's walk through these three evidences, these three miracles that take place here. The first is the miracle of the restoration of two women in verses 18 through 26. The point here is Jesus brings his presence and his power to touch the lives of the hurting, to even restore life to the dead happens in this text. He touches and gives life and restoration. And God himself is experienced through Jesus, through faith, is what happens here in this passage. It's interesting in this passage, the concept of touching. We see it several times in the first couple miracles here. In chapter 9, verse 18, this text just says ruler to us. Now, in the other Gospels, Mark, for instance, tells us his name, and that he's just a ruler. He's the ruler of the synagogue. This is Jairus in Mark 5, and he is the ruler of the synagogue. And it's interesting, this concept of touch in the first century. It's easier for us to miss it because the synagogue ruler would have known if you touch unclean or specifically dead or bloody things, what happens to you? You become unclean. He makes a bold request here. Jesus, would you come and touch my daughter who's dead? He knows the concept of unclean. He knows that any rabbi should not do this. No one should do this, in a sense, from Old Testament law perspective. And he is desperate. And he says, will you touch my daughter to heal her? It's interesting that in this very context, as Jesus agrees to go, verse 19, that verse 20, suddenly as he's going along, what happens? Another woman, there's a comparison between the two in the text here even. There's a flow of blood for 12 years from this woman who touches him. And in Mark as well, it tells us that the girl was 12 years old. There's two women here that are both unclean. Both have an issue of blood or death, which is unclean in the Old Testament. Don't touch. And what does she do? She knows this power of Jesus and thinks to herself, if I can just touch him, that I will be healed. I want you to notice in this text, as the woman touches Jesus, that Jesus turns and gently points her out. He calls her, daughter, a beloved kind of invitation, a beloved title here. A woman that would have been called unclean, unclean. He says, daughter. He gently talks to her. And it's interesting in here, he tries to connect the dots for her. You see, she's touched him and been healed, but he wants her to understand what just took place. You know, I was last week, we had a problem with the conference monitor in the back, this TV in the back. It's been having a hard time coming on last couple weeks. And the guys came in to do the sound. The sound folks came in last week and we're like, it's on. And they're like, how did you do it? And I said, magic fingers. And they were like, no, really, why? Like, how did you do that? Like, teach us so that we can do this, you know? And I'm like, magic fingers, okay? And so, I did explain to them how I did it. But the point being, sometimes we're like, hey, maybe this woman has magic fingers, or maybe Jesus' garments were magic garments. Is that the point of this text? No, Jesus wants to connect the dots from the healing to this concept of faith in this text. See how he points it out to her in this passage. He says here, as he talks to this woman, Jesus said to her, verse 22, daughter, be of good cheer. He says what? Your faith has made you well. He points out to her, connects the dots for her. It's not some magic fingers of touch here or magic garments that emanated something. It's you had faith, and God works this way. If you believe, what is he? He's gracious and merciful to give. But he works through what? Through faith. And Jesus connects the dots for her. You believed, and the presence and power of God was at work. He makes sure she connects those dots here in this passage. God is experienced through faith. It's an important connection for us today as well. We're going to get back to that in a few minutes here. Jesus in this passage, though, runs right on to the next thing. This couple of miracles here in the first one. He goes to the ruler's house, verse 23. Now, first century burial process had to take place pretty quickly because they didn't have some of the technology we have today, and so typically burials would take pretty quickly, after the death of the individual. You can see as they get home, they've started without the father even being there. So dad's coming home and funeral stuff is already kind of underway. I was also reading this week about first century stuff, and it was commonplace for even the poorest families to hire 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman for a burial ceremony. I'm like, this is not what I think of the burial. But this is what took place. You see it right here in this text, right? They came, verse 23, to the house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing. They had more than 1 wailing woman. I mean, what a scene, right? So they have a crowd of wailers, professional wailers at a funeral, and they had multiple flute players. Wow, what a scene that Jesus comes up on here in this text. And I want you to notice here that as they arrive, Jesus commands the crowd to do what? Like, go away. And he makes this statement, the girl's not dead but sleeping. Do you think that that's a helpful comment? At least did the crowd take that as a helpful comment at that moment? Like, oh, is Jesus saying here, oh, she's just taking a nap. You just misjudged the situation. And they're like, who are you and what are you saying in the middle of, like, this is a very inappropriate thing to say at a funeral beginning here. And they ridicule him, the text says. They laugh at and ridicule him. This is the response of the crowd to Jesus. But despite their response, what does Jesus do? He comes in, he gently touches and raises up this 12-year-old girl to be healed. From death, his touch brings life. Uncleanness doesn't spread to him, not just cleanness, but life spreads to the dead here. Jesus, again, his touch gives life. God is experienced power and life through faith. The faith of this father, the faith of this woman in this passage. Let's move to miracle number 2 in this passage, verses 27 to 31. The miracle of the restoration of 2 blind men. Jesus leaves, verse 27 tells us, from there, and he goes along, and behind him, 2 blind men are somehow following him, shouting, Son of David, have mercy upon us. This is the first time in the Gospel of Matthew that we've heard this title for Jesus, Son of David, other than the opening words of Matthew's text. In the opening words, we get a genealogy in chapter 1, and we hear that Jesus is the son of Abraham, son of David. But this is the first time in Matthew's record of the ministry of Jesus that this title comes in. It is a messianic title. They're saying, you are the promised son of David. You need to think 2 Samuel 7, the promise is given to David that your son and ultimately the Messiah will come from your line. And so in this passage, they address him as such, and Jesus turns to them, verse 28, and again, we see him connect the dots. Do you really believe? Do you really believe? Because again, we need to understand God is experienced through what? Through faith. And here he says, do you really believe? And they say, yes. And Jesus says, verse 29, according to your faith, what's going to happen? Let it be to you. And they believe, and their sight is restored through the touch of Jesus Christ. The next miracle is found in verse 32 through 34. It's the miracle of restoration of the mute. This short section here, a man is unable to speak. He's demon possessed. And the text simply tells us that Jesus cast out the demon. Cast out the demon, and all of a sudden the man is able to speak. And the crowd does what? The crowd marvels. The crowd's in awe of this amazing miracle. But I want you to notice here, we've seen this already in the passage of the crowd, the first crowd. We've seen it in the context of the religious leaders also. But I want you to notice in verse 34, the growing opposition. In 9:3, the leaders had this inner feeling, this inner accusation. He must be blaspheming. He's a blasphemer. They had this inner kind of thought about Jesus in chapter 9, verse 3. But here in verse 34, what happens? That inner thought does what? It comes out. This inner thought comes out, and here they express it this way. They say, he casts out demons by the ruler of the demons. In other words, it's an inside job. He is demonic. And that's how he has power over the demon. That's where his true power lies, is what they're saying here in this passage. It is big accusations. We're being tricked here. Don't listen to this guy. He is demon possessed. And so with this undercurrent of opposition, with the accusations that are flying Jesus' way openly now, what is Jesus going to do? What would we do? I think sometimes we're tempted when there's opposition, we're tempted to go into hiding and isolation. That's what we're tempted to do when bad things are happening against us. We're like, build the walls higher, keep the bad people out, and just have our friends in here. We have a tendency to isolate and oppose, either oppose equally as strong or isolate away from. I want you to know that Jesus doesn't do those things. What he does here is he invites, he heals and blesses, and he invites others to be part of the few, to be part of those who respond to him. Now I want to think about this as it describes it here. As we're thinking about this passage of we're called to be the few. We're invited to be the few along with Jesus here. What is this? What's happening here? This question, remember at the beginning of the section, why aren't you like us, Jesus? Why aren't you fasting like we're fasting? Why don't you join us? And Jesus says that's not the question. The new is here. This is the fulfillment of all these things. I'm the Messiah, as he's saying here. And now he asks us to join him. It's an important call for us today. But I ask you this morning, what does it look like to be the few? How can we fulfill this call in this passage? Again, evidence is in front of us. But our problem isn't evidence, it's authority and submission to God. But what does that look like? What does it look like to be the few? Who is Jesus and how are we to respond to him? This one who is the life giver, the sight restorer, the demon caster outer, the word giver to the mute. The one who's King of kings and Lord of lords, as Matthew is showing us over and over again. He's Messiah King. And we're to get on board with his agenda rather than try to say, hey, God, you get on board with my agenda. So what does this look like? I want to give you 3 words here this morning. Just to think about together of what it means to be the few in this passage. The first word is faith. The first word is faith. Jesus, Messiah, in this closing section here, verse 35 and following, Jesus, Messiah, goes about the countryside and he is teaching, but he's preaching and he's healing the sick and the diseased from among the people. But I want you to remember in this context of the miracles and the specific connecting of the dots that Jesus gives here, how is Jesus doing miracles? What is he honoring with the sick and the lame and the mute and even the dead, the Father that asks? What he's doing is he is doing miracles based on what? their faith. They're believing in him. And the power and presence of God are experienced through Jesus by faith in this passage. I want you to remember, faith, if faith is what is needed to experience the presence and power of God, we have to understand that a little bit. Is faith like magic fingers? Like, you got to have the magic fingers to some people have the magic fingers and some people don't. Is that what faith is? Like, some of you have like magic finger faith, and others of you just don't have it. I'm sorry, Like I can turn the TV on and some of you just can't do it, Is that what it's about when it comes to faith? No, right? Not in this passage at all. Faith is the divinely ordained means of experiencing God's presence and power. We are turning to the object of our faith, Jesus Christ, and trusting in him alone. That's what faith is. Now, let me also point out here that when some of us hear, okay, faith is the means by which, the divine means that I experience his presence and power, then I got a powerful tool in my pocket. Like I can use this and I can get whatever I want from God because I got that kind of arm-twisting faith to make him do what I want. You're misunderstanding what faith is. Faith is not a tool for you to manipulate God. Like, if this is how faith works, then I got God to do whatever I want to do because I'm just going to believe it and then I'll receive it. You're missing the point of faith. This is God's divinely ordained means of experiencing him. You and I are meant to be, we're called to be the few, to get on board with his agenda, to believe his words, and to trust in him and submit to those words. I'm called to follow him and believe him. There are many in this passage and many today who jeer at and are opposed to the words of Jesus. Like, he says this and we're like, I don't want to do that. I want to do my way and my agenda and my kingdom. Like we open with here a little bit. Why are you doing this? Why don't you get on board with the agenda of the other religious leaders? Why don't you get on board with me, God, instead of me, by faith, submitting to you in your way and trusting in you? Is the call and the invitation to respond with faith that leans into Christ alone, that depends on his touch in our life. I have nothing else. I'm going to trust you and your word alone, is what faith does, faith in action. And it's what God honors. It's what he calls the few to be and how to act. Secondly, the word is not just faith, but how to be the few, it's compassion. I want you to notice in the final verses here, it highlights this key attribute of God. Back in the beginning of Israel being formed into a nation, the Exodus event, as Jesus reveals himself to his people in Exodus 34, verse 6 is a powerful verse. And one of the first attributes of God is that he is compassionate. He's merciful and gracious. Other texts quote that as the compassion of God Almighty. Pity from the core of who he is what this word means. I want you to notice in this passage, it's what's missing in the religious leaders in Jesus' day. I believe it's a key ingredient that's missing in the church today. We have a tendency to not understand and embrace and live in the compassion of Jesus Christ for others. We're busy looking at life through our own selfish eyes. We're busy with a perspective that says, you conform to me, I'm not going to conform to you. And so we're looking at what you can do for me. I'm looking at what you did against me. I don't see you with any eyes of compassion. And I want you to notice these very people who laugh at and ridicule Jesus, these people who accuse him of being demonic in this passage. Right after this text, Jesus continues to bless and to heal. And what does it say is welling up within him? Compassion, compassion, compassion. We fail to see the weary and the wandering. We fail to see the lost and the leaderless. We fail to move toward the hurting with compassion. If you want to be the few, then take up and learn from Jesus in this passage Ask God to give you the compassion of his heart for those around you. Compassion, this key ingredient to see. God, give me the eyes and the heart to see others how you see them. As sheep without a shepherd, scattered and weary, this text says, as Jesus saw the crowds. God, give me this. And if you get the compassion, if God grants that request, God, help us have compassion. It'll change everything about how you live and operate and speak and listen. It'll change everything about how you work with others and be a blessing to them, as we see Jesus doing in this passage. Jesus had compassion. The few that he calls to follow him and join him in his mission, he calls to have compassion. The last thing I want to mention about this is to be the few: faith, compassion, and the last word is prayer. Prayer. Notice in the last verse of this passage, therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. It points to the divine need here. Yes, there's a call to join Jesus and exhibit practical faith, serving and helping the hurting. Make no mistake about that. But all the service in the world without the presence and power of God are nothing. All the gathering to worship and sing our great Redeemer without the presence and power of God is nothing. It's in vain. We're called in this passage to pray. If you want to reach people, you want to see heart change, hurt people rescued, sinners turned to saints, the lost found, if that's what you want, you need divine help. I need divine help. God, would you work in the hearts of others? Would you use me for such a mighty task as this? The labor, the harvest fields of the word that you call and invite me to participate in with you. God, it's not just go and do. The first thing it calls us to do is here to pray. Pray. This is not just step one. This is the ongoing step of the followers of Jesus. If you're to be the few, you and I are called to be people of prayer. Faith in this passage, experience of the power of God. The practical application, pray. Exercise faith in the words of God and the call to, he wants to be part of his harvest field, to be his laborers. The Lord of the harvest wants to work through the few to accomplish much in this passage. You know, it's kind of scary, the stats about the American church. I don't know about the church around the world, but in the American church, the most neglected service is which service? It's the prayer service. The most neglected service of all the churches in America, including our own, is the prayer service. And I just ask you today, I'm not here to produce some sort of guilt, false guilt in you, but I ask you, if we want to experience the presence and power of God, this text says, if you want to be the few, what are we called to be? We're called to be people of prayer. It starts and continues on our knees. I can't dodge that application from this text. I mean, think about the kind of work that would happen in America if the prayer service turned into the most attended service. Just consider for a moment. God wants to work through people on their knees. He does work through people on your knees. That's how his work begins, and that's how his work is sustained. Now listen, there's a lot here in this text today, a lot for us to understand. There's ridiculing, rejecting of Jesus. There's some experiences here of the power of God that are happening, healing happening through faith. There's an invitation in this passage to not have Jesus try to be conformed to us, but to us be conformed to Jesus Christ, to join Jesus in being the few. And I ask you today, will you believe him? Will you believe him? Faith, that seed of faith, let it grow in you. as you respond to his word, believe his word, and trust in him alone? Will you see others with eyes of compassion? This love of Christ dramatically missing today as we look at our neighbors around us. Will you pray? Perhaps the most practical application of this text is you and I are called, if we're to be the few of this passage, then we must be on our knees. If you want to reap the harvest that God has for you in your life, what does he call you to do first? And ongoing in this walk of being a laborer alongside Jesus. To be the few, it's call to prayer. So I just invite you to respond with me as we close our time in prayer. Let me pray with you. Let's respond together. Lord God, thank you for the text today and this call that's immensely practical. A call that connects for us what faith is. It's your means of experiencing your presence and power. It's our means to experience your presence and power. It's not a manipulation tool. It's simply responding to you. It's believing in who you are and boldly asking, boldly following, boldly believing what you say. God, I pray that as we think about faith today, that you'd connect the dots in our own heart. Lord, this is how you work. God, I pray for my own heart and the heart of others here today that you would grow compassion in us. Lord, our responses in our marriages, our responses among our family members, our responses to those around us often evidences a lack of this. I don't see their hurting, I just see how they hurt me. And I respond in like kind. God, we have such a desperate need to grow in compassion. God, give us the eyes and the heart of Jesus in this passage. And God, I pray as we just pause to just ask you to apply even the last the kind of point of this text here, this call to pray. Lord, it's not just you serve and you do and you act and you do, act, be a performer. It's not a call for us to just in our own strength go forward. It's a call to today and every day come before you on our knees, submissive to you, asking you, the Lord of the harvest, to do the work, the divine work that only you can do. And so, God, would you produce humility and dependence in us? Would you cause us as individuals, as a church, to be those who are constant in prayer? Oh, God, would you revive us? Would you revive our church and churches in America to be people of prayer? That the Lord of the harvest has a ready harvest field waiting for the few, and this key response to pray. Lord, we need to respond. And there's things in our life that we got to stop asking you to conform to us. And like this text puts before us, that we need to conform to you. So continue your work in us, I ask, God, by your grace. With your patient, loving hand, would you continue the work in us that we so desperately need? That we'd never just do on our own because we love our crown, we love our way. But we need you, God. Continue to mold and shape, to clean, to purify. Continue working us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.